a regenerative model was kind of the only ethical way to feed humans and was the only ethical way to maintain the planet around us so that we can grow food.
This film, Sacred Cow, what is the premise behind the film and the mission behind it?
Oh man, we had seen a lot of kind of vegan oriented material come out over the years, and they had a very consistent message about the hazards of meat consumption, animal product consumption from a health perspective. And then more recently, there's been a lot of discussion around this idea that animal products, raising cattle on grasslands and whatnot was this huge contributor to climate change. And then there's always in the background of that been this kind of ethical consideration around, should we even eat animals? Is this an ethical proposition? And so Diana and I, for a long time, knew that we were going to do a book, and eventually realized that a film would be a great way to cover this material, because not everybody's going to sit down and read a book, and you can tackle these complex topics in a little bit more of an emotive way in a film versus doing more the clinical kind of scientific, breakdown that a book is really nice for. The cool thing about laying this stuff out in a book versus like social media or a blog post, like you can have some long form stuff and really create some long ideas and everything. So we felt to discuss and look into the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of an animal inclusive food system. Like that's the whole enchilada there, like literally. And we kind of start things off interestingly. We thought that we were going to dig into the ethics side first, but as we started getting into this story and started doing research, we made some realizations. A couple of the realizations were that it's really hard to grow a human well without animal products. It can be done like a purely vegan approach, and you supplement people with like algae oil for EPA and DHA for the brain, and supplemental iron and zinc and protein concentrates, B12. But it's not the easiest thing in the world. And there was right in the writing of this book, there was a fascinating study that came out where they followed very well-to-do, like average income was over $200,000, Finnish families that were vegan. And they had like 2,000 of these folks. So they're in Finland, very wealthy, northern, Nordic country, high average income there, very highly educated. And what was interesting, and these folks were excited about being vegans. There's kind of a joke, who will tell you that they're a vegan or a CrossFitter first, and there's right. A whole kind of funny meme around that. These folks were super compliant, really excited to share their experiences with the researchers, to such a degree that the researchers actually noted that, these folks were, super compliant, very helpful. Nutrient deficiencies were rampant with these folks. Iron, zinc, omega-3s, all of the kids that had been raised largely vegan, none of them met basic growth standards, as far as like height. Certainly they were definitely not overweight, so that was potentially a good thing, but none of them were at, kind of 50th percentile on height, which is usually a sign of nutrient deficiency. Usually when humans are well fed, they tend to be tall and robustly built and all that type of stuff. So this was something that was interesting to us. Like we were seeing hints of this in the literature, that a vegan or very, very minimal animal product based diet for a mom is difficult, for a baby in utero is difficult, once the child is born is difficult, because the breast milk is oftentimes so nutrient deficient. Like there was a example of a French mother whose breast milk was so nutrient deficient that her baby died from nutrient deficiency. She was vegan, but she was breastfeeding. She was so nutrient deficient that the baby died from this. It's terrible, but there are these examples that pop up. And so we started kind of looking at this in a different way. If it's hard, bordering on impossible, for a super wealthy, highly educated group of people to raise their kids without nutrient deficiencies on a vegan diet. How ethical is this to recommend to a general population? And what does this mean for at-risk populations, people living at the margin, where one of the biggest features that distinguish, like, say, academic success versus failure is access to these nutrient-rich foods, brain development and stuff like that. So that was interesting. It started changing the questions, right? Like, historically, the ethics was just around, are things being killed, yes or no? If they are killed, like, how does it happen? What's their life like, and all that stuff? And that's all still important. But we started getting this, like, if you literally can't raise a human, or it's very difficult to raise a human in a household that earns above $200,000 a year, and everybody's got a master's degree in something, and it's hard to feed them on a vegan diet in a way that the kids aren't nutrient deficient, what does this mean? Like, what does that ethically mean for the rest of the story? And then when we really started digging into the land use side, and we started uncovering the reality that without animal inputs into farmland, the land dies. Like, some amount of rotational grazing, like if you grow wheat in an area, okay, but you should probably have some animals involved with that, because it helps to renutrify the soil. It expands the soil microbiome. We know for a fact that the application of synthetic chemical fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides is damaging to the local ecology. It's very damaging to the soil microbiome, and that causes all kinds of problems. And really, at the end of our analysis on that, it seemed like it was hard, bordering on impossible, to have a food system that could last like 5,000 years without animal product input, without animals playing a role in this. And part of what it was interesting, it's kind of a one-off example, but Diana became aware of this vegan family. They were vegan, and they decided that they wanted to start raising their own food. So they bought a farm, and they started raising, their fruits and vegetables. But then what they noticed was that they were totally reliant on either synthetic chemical fertilizers, or these, like buying basically like fish meal to put the fish meal in. And they're like, well, that's not really vegan. And what they figured out is that they needed animals as part of the farm to make it a closed loop system. So they got some cows, and they got some pigs, and they got some chickens, and they started raising them. And then they started asking the question, like, do we just raise these guys until they die and then we get new animals, or do we actually start eating some of the animals? So what ultimately ended up happening is they started raising and growing, breeding the animals, and they would eat only the animals that they raised. And then what was kind of wacky about that, though, is that these folks were part of a vegan, like, restaurant setup, and their financial backers kind of freaked out that they were now eating meat and had this whole story to tell. So Diana had interviewed them up until pretty early in the film development, and then they just wouldn't return her calls after that, because they didn't want this story being told about this family shifting from vegan to basically being like 18th century farmers, where they're integrating this whole thing. But we had this ethical side of, can you raise humans with animal products? And then we had this kind of consideration around, can you even develop a food system without animal input? And it didn't seem like you could. You're not going to grow it. Like, people will say, well, we can just grow meat in a vat, lab meat. And they don't understand that you have to go raise corn and soy and all these things, have them processed, and then turn that into nutrient media to put into a vat to grow it. It's like, you don't get rid of industrial row crop food systems doing that. And so it changed the whole ethical story a lot. Like, you maybe can't grow humans without animal product inputs, and we maybe can't have a food system that would go on indefinitely. Like, if when we're talking about sustainability, we need to build something that if you came back 5,000 years from now, the ecology is as good or better than it is now. The food production is as good or better than it is now. The humans involved in that system are as healthy or healthier than we are now, hopefully healthier, because by and large, we're not all that healthy right now. And so it was interesting that then when we circle back around to the legit ethical consideration, yeah, we need to talk about death and the right and wrongness of that, and the fact that there is no bloodless food system. Like if you want row crops as far of corn and soy as far as the eyes can see, you're going to kill a ton of things in that process, and herbicides, pesticides, combines,
Rodents.
the rodents. I mean, just on and on. There have been pretty good studies that suggest that you kill far more animals in that system than you would a very meat-centric, like grass-based food system. So that's how we circled around this whole thing, and that was kind of the original imperative for why this thing needed to, this book and the film needed to be done. And we really tried to get this stuff right. Like there were painful parts of the story that we wish had gone differently, like the reality that pastured meat isn't that much different nutritionally than conventional meat. Pastured dairy is much more nutritionally dense. Pastured eggs is more nutritional. Wild caught fish is more nutritionally dense. But man, cows and sheep and stuff like that are just remarkably good at taking low quality food inputs and turning them into super high quality nutritious food. And so this is one of those inconvenient things that we were like, man, this is going to be tough. We're going to get some blowback for this. And we did, but we really tried to be as objective and let the science take us where it would. And, but we had to cover all three of these topics, because when you start discussing health in like an online format or like a debate or something, you can make some pretty good progress, but then inevitably the person will say, well, what about the environment? What about the ethics? And so it becomes this game of whack-a-mole, and you have to be able to integrate them all together. And what was interesting to us was that a decentralized animal-centric model was the thing that provided likely the most food, the most nutrient-dense food, had the lowest death burden. Like you killed the fewest animals, interestingly, relative to this other stuff. And it arguably might be the only system that really is legitimately long-term sustainable, that you could come back literally 5,000 years from now and this food system is still working. And we have some examples of stuff like that. Like there are farms that have the ownership traced back 1,800 years in like Scotland and in different places in Ireland. There's some, closed loop food systems in Southeast Asia and whatnot that are plant animal, inclusive. And so we have examples of this stuff where these systems haven't destroyed their local environment. It doesn't really address the idea around like greenhouse gas emissions and whatnot. And we do get into that stuff, and we could talk about it if you want to, dig into that. But that was the big challenge, the big topics, and we didn't go into it expecting to have the ethical story propped up by the human nutrition and also the environmental story, that a regenerative model was kind of the only ethical way to feed humans, and was the only ethical way to maintain the planet around us so that we can grow food.
Yeah, it's profound. And when you said whack-a-mole, that really hit it on the head, literally, because literally, folks don't think about, and there's great examples in the film as well. If you're just trying to grow a lot of lettuce, like as in a lot, not just a lot, but right. a field of lettuce, you're going to have to proactively kill a lot of animals that are going to be trying to feast on your lettuce, or you're just not going to have lettuce. And so they had these great examples, and we just don't think about those things. We don't think about what's going into the food that we're getting oftentimes, because we're so disconnected from it as a society. And our ancestors, we have, great lineages of folks, generations before us, who were thinking about generations to come and implementing things in growing food or hunting or strategy, whatever it is, thinking about 2 generations ahead, for example, like some Native American cultures. In our society right now, if we really think about this, we're actually genius at growing a lot of food at one time.
Right.
All of these different industrial chemicals and fertilizers, they work amazing.
It's a miracle.
It is a miracle. Yeah. However, and that's the other side of it, we can grow a lot of food at one time, but we're going to be utterly destroying the topsoil. And we don't think about the fact of, the microbiome is this big part of our lexicon now. But there's a microbiome of the soil itself that has a direct relationship to your microbiome and the food that you're going to be getting. And so if we're proactively just not thinking about the fact that we're tearing it down, and you provided so many great examples in the film, and also, again, there's the book that goes along with this, but of basically creating these food deserts, not like in the conventional sense today where it's like a neighborhood that doesn't have access to high quality food, but literally just destroying the soil, and it's just turning into a place where you can't grow anything.
Right.
And repeating that process, finding a new place to destroy, because we're pulling animals out of the equation, which throughout evolution, period, human evolution, as far back as we can see, that is how sustainable environments were, And so this is what I want to ask you about next in that context, because again, I remember, even being in school and having these ideas thrown my way about, cow farts and cow burps are like tearing a hole in the ozone layer.
Right.
These cows are going to kill us, this whole thing. And the crazy thing is, I don't know if you know this as well recently, but the ozone layer is like, quote, healing itself.
Right.
With the advent, there hasn't been a reduction necessarily in growing cattle. If anything, it's been more. And, these factory farming practices. So what's going on there? Well, actually, we're addressing some other things that are really more of the culprit. But so can you talk about that a little bit, that idea about cows being one of the underpinning aspects of destroying the environment versus them being a solution, ruminant animals, in healing the environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's crystal clear that, or maybe not crystal clear, but the evidence suggests that the planet is warming and that sea levels are rising, like ice caps are retreating. People, so we were talking about you and your son were watching, like, science oriented shows. Every once in a while you'll check out a show that talks about like ancient Greece or ancient Italy. And what's interesting is the ruins that they find are underwater in the Mediterranean Ocean, right off the coast of like Greece and Italy and whatnot, because the sea levels have risen over time. The planet's warming up. One thing that's worth mentioning, though, is they describe the period of time that we're in currently is the interglacial period. It's the time between glaciers. The planet tends to be glaciated more than not. And we're kind of lucky that it's not covered with glaciers all the way down to like the border of Mexico and the United States, and, similar deal coming up from south, because there's not a whole lot of land to live on when it, in it's very harsh environments. But sea levels are much lower in those environments because a lot of water gets locked up in ice. The Netherlands are an interesting example where sea levels have been rising for 400 or 500 years, and 2/3 of the Netherlands are below sea level. They've just been building dikes around themselves over time as sea levels rise, and they've been working to stay ahead of this stuff. So it's not super controversial that this stuff is happening. What is more controversial is this idea that biogenic sources of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, even water is a greenhouse gas. And what happens in this scenario is certain types of gases, when sunlight shines through it, some gases like oxygen, the light shines through, the oxygen doesn't absorb, or nitrogen doesn't absorb heat specifically. And the heat, the light shines on the earth, heat radiates back out into space, and there's just kind of an equilibrium there. It's similar to the inside of a car getting very, very warm in the summer. Glass has this interesting characteristic where it will let sunlight through, but infrared radiation, heat, it doesn't let back out very well. So the light shines in, the car seat and the interior gets hot and re-radiates heat as infrared radiation. And because infrared is a shorter wavelength than the regular visible light, it can't get out of the window very well. So the heat will accumulate. And so at 85-degree day, you could have 130-degree temperature inside of a car. That can and does happen to some, in our atmosphere. And there's this fear that the release of things like methane and carbon dioxide is going to heat the earth, and it almost certainly is at least a part of this story. The problem with this, though, is that cows are part of a cycle. So when a cow burps and it releases methane, methane is a carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms attached to it. That carbon came from carbon that was part of carbohydrates that were part of a plant that was growing not that long ago. And that plant, via photosynthesis, took energy from the sun and removed carbon dioxide from the air to make protein, lipids, and carbohydrates that then animals eat, like cows. And then the cows either burp that out, or it becomes part of the carbon of their structure, their fat and protein, and then maybe we eat that. But the source of biogenic greenhouse gases really needs to be accounted for differently, because it's a cycle. Once that methane goes into the atmosphere, and methane is definitely a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon is, or carbon dioxide is, but it's only got a lifespan of about 10 years. And then it gets cleaved into carbon dioxide and water, and then it's back into the regular carbon dioxide carbon cycle. But this carbon gets released into the atmosphere, it gets brought back into plants, those plants get eaten, or the plants die and mulch, and then are released as carbon dioxide themselves, or potentially methane. But all of that is part of a long-term cycle. The thing that you really want to look at is things like fossil fuel use, where we're taking carbon that has been underground for hundreds of millions of years, and we're releasing it kind of in mass. And this is one of the ironic things about regenerative agriculture, and this is one of the kind of weird things about this whole climate change topic. NASA released this report that as carbon dioxide levels have increased, the planet has gotten more green because plants grow faster. One of the rate limiting steps of plants growing is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And like people growing anything from marijuana to ornamental flowers have known for a long time that if they trickle a little bit of carbon dioxide into their greenhouses, that it will enhance the speed with which their plants grow. So plants are growing faster and absorbing more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then there's this piece of this whole regenerative ag story, which is that in grasslands, if you have plants and animals interacting the way that they have throughout all of history, the roots of plants stick a lot of carbon underground. And it's possible that we may be able to sequester and remove carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and actually rebuild topsoil as part of that process. And I know I bounced around a bunch of different things there, but the notion that the carbon that comes out of cattle in the form of either carbon dioxide or methane is a primary vector of climate change. One, the people within different circles in the media have said that cattle contribute as much as 78% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's not remotely close to the right number. It's more like 2% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But that 2% is part of a cycle. It goes out, it comes in, it goes out, it comes in. And it's worth mentioning that if we removed all animal husbandry from our food systems, we would still need to raise other stuff. We would, we'd have to raise other grains, other legumes to replace the meat that we're not consuming. And it would only reduce our total carbon, footprint by about 3%. But so, if we got rid of all animal husbandry, and even that, I don't know that I fully agree with, because I think that in holistically managed animals, there's this potential of reversing desertification and improving the carbon capture of grasslands. And some of that stuff is still debatable. Maybe it's not as powerful as what we think, but for sure we can reverse desertification. And we saw that as part of the film, like the rancher down in the Chihuahuan desert that has reversed 1 million acres of desert and turned it back into grassland. So this is area now that is highly productive, and all these animals have returned to the area, different bird species. It's worth noting that the Audubon Society has become a huge advocate of regenerative agriculture because they notice the return of bird species in these areas where regenerative ag practices occur.
Yeah, that was one of the most remarkable parts of the film, for sure, to see that a desert could be reversed into a place where, potentially, again, we could have food growing.
Right.
We could have, but also, if we take animals out of the equation, if we just look at how things have gone, throughout our evolution, this is the natural process of things. And keeping the soil that we do have that's healthy, keeping it healthy, so we're not messing up more stuff that we then have to try to fix. So this is where animals come into the picture. So another big aspect of this is, you mentioned this. So the ozone layer is, quote, healing itself, but then we have other potential environmental issues going on with the warming of the planet. And I love that analogy of light, the green, if we think about the greenhouse effect. And, I love the analogy with the car, for example. We've all experienced that on a hot day. We get into our car and we're just like baking.
Right.
And also, have you ever left a water bottle in the car, plastic water bottle in your car, and it's gotten warmed up and then you could taste the plastic?
Right, right.
Which is a whole other thing, because plastics don't even biodegrade, really. They photodegrade. And so even light can break them down, especially heat. So We're drinking a little plastic tea. But that's neither here nor there. But, being able to see this process firsthand and what we can actually do to help turn this stuff around. So if you could you articulate just a little bit about what regenerative agriculture looks like? Because I saw in the film, like, they were actually moving animals around using technology instead of what would happen through our evolution, which would be other animals helping to guide them, food sources guiding them, predators guiding them, using technology to guide them.
Yeah, so that's a really important piece that I oftentimes forget to mention. People are like, well, why is this stuff important? It's kind of funny. There's kind of two camps out there. One camp is this kind of leave it alone camp, which we shouldn't have animals on pasture. We should just let it lie fallow, let it return to nature, which ironically returning to nature is having animals on it. Like 2/3 of the planet's landmass is grasslands, and many of the grasses only propagate if there's fire. That's part of their seed, dispersal thing. And then many of them only propagate if the plant is eaten and the seed goes through the digestive tract of an animal. But so on the one hand, people look at say like some downsides of animal husbandry, like nitrogen spillover into waterways, like because we raise so many animals in confined areas that their urine and their feces have high nitrogen content that can end up in waterways, that can cause these blooms of algae that sucks all the oxygen out of the water, and it can cause fish to die off. Like there's this huge area in the Gulf of Mexico that is killed each year due to this nitrogen runoff. In the past, our farms were small and decentralized, and all that nitrogen stayed on the farm. That's what we used to grow next year's crop instead of having this stuff kind of spill away. But people will say, well, we don't want these animals creating this problem, so we just shouldn't have them. And that's one thought. And the other thought is that just let these animals go do what they do, and we don't really need to manage them, just stick them on grasslands. And what that has done in the past has led to overgrazing, particularly when we start putting up fences and the animals can't move around, and when we kill off predators. The way that grazing animals, cattle in particular, things like bison and cattle, they tend to bunch together. And they do that so that they protect the bulk of the members of the herd from things like wolves and lions and other large predators. Once you remove those large predators, there's a tendency for these animals to just kind of go where they want to go. There's not the predator-prey interaction. And what you will end up with in that scenario is that if you put cows onto pasture, and really it's any type of grazing animal, but you put these animals onto pasture, they'll eat the things that they like. And they have a tendency to like certain types of forage more than others. And then they'll kind of move around and eat the other forage. But then when the forage that they ate maybe a week ago starts growing back, they'll come back and eat that again. And that will cause the plant to die. And it'll kill the root system, and the area can get overgrazed, and it can lead actually to desertification. So an area of grassland can turn into desert by overgrazing it. It can also turn into desert by undergrazing it. And because people, right or wrong, aren't comfortable with releasing large herds of wolves or mountain lions or, other apex predators to keep these animals in check. What we need to do is move them around using things like portable electric fencing so that when they hit an area, they eat everything because the animals are competing with each other. And then when they've eaten everything in an area, they may only be on there like a day, a half a day. And then you open up another section of grass and they move on to that next section of grass. And the area that the animals were just on gets peed on and gets pooed on. And with these holistic practices, you don't deworm the cattle typically, or even the horses, because the dung beetles play this really critical role in disseminating like the nutrients out of the dung back into the soil and part of the microbiome, the soil microbiome. So it's kind of crazy, but they're actually a critical little beetles that play with poo are this critical feature of a healthy grassland and ecosystem. But this is where we can emulate the predator prey interaction that has kept grasslands healthy for hundreds of millions of years. And we can do something like that using some technology like satellite imaging to tell when different areas of grass is ready to be grazed or not grazed. And then we can use portable electric fencing that is solar powered so that we can move the animals around and have them eat the grass that is the most appropriate to be eaten at that time and keep it as healthy as possible. And also it tends to really dramatically increase the productivity of that land. Like Joel Salatin, he gets about 5 times more cattle per acre on his land than the people around him because of the way that he runs things. And so he doesn't need an operation that's 5 times larger. He gets 5 times more productivity out of the area that he has. And this is also one of the things that addresses scalability. Like he lives in Virginia also, which is very amenable to food production. Like it has a pretty modest climate. The winters are not super severe. They get some snow, but it's not like Montana where the ground freezes and stuff like that. So you don't get the same scalability everywhere, but virtually anywhere that you can run animals on grass, you can get better productivity at some point by holistically managing them and better managing their forage.
Yeah, and the education is the key, because these other farmers, they just simply don't know that they can be yielding better results. And this is why this film is so important, and of course the book as well, just to get educated on these things. Because again, ultimately, yes, we want to be as healthy as possible, but we require food for that. And also, if we're thinking about future generations, we need to take care of our soil. We need to take care of the land that we do have. And now to know that there's ways that we can actually potentially heal the soil, heal the land to be able to then grow more and better food is really inspiring. But instead, we'll just order an Impossible Burger,
Right.
Now, this is not a knock. I don't want people tripping if they're a big fan of Impossible Burgers. But if you look at the underlying reason behind it, it's these reasons that you then are addressing, the health aspect, which you address. Is it the ethical side as well, which we don't think about, even if you're growing plants, all the animals that have to die in that process. And also, first of all, I mean, if you really think about this, and I know this, I think you as well, but I've done all kinds of protocols. I mean, I'll take years at a time at a clip and do a ketogenic protocol, a vegan protocol, raw food protocol. I only ate raw plant foods for a couple of years, very, very early on, before the Model Health Show existed, and just to see what happens, and what I found is that most stuff works for a while, but it's always about dialing in what your body needs right now. And so, but in that, I was searching for a burger replacement. There's something about a burger in our culture that we're constantly searching for. And the crazy thing is, if you don't want to eat animals, and stop fiddling with the burgers, kind of like you're trying to trick yourself when you're still infatuated with a thing. It's kind of like Kanye, losing Kim Kardashian and then getting a woman who looks just like her.
Right.
What are you doing, Kanye? Right. So can you talk a little bit about that? Not about Kanye, unless you want to, but about this process of, jumping to, the Beyond Meats, the Impossible Burgers that require so many highly processed ingredients just to be able to make them. You know, we don't think about that aspect as well. Whereas for some folks, this can be a temporary thing, like a burger every now and then. But as you know, most folks are like, they're leaning into being a processed food, vegan or vegetarian protocol.
Right, right. Diana and I have been talking about this for a while, but it's I think it was like 4 years ago that I mentioned that people like Bill Gates and others in the tech scene want to drive the future of food like software. They want it to be IP, intellectual property, that's owned. And when I was mentioning stuff like that 4 years ago, people thought I was nuts. Oh, what are you talking about? You know, where's your proof on that? And it's like they say it. You know, I mean, Bill Gates is on record saying that. Many of the backers of Impossible Foods, they've said, we want to run this like a software company. We want to own the intellectual property of the food that people eat. And then COVID hit. And then all kinds of shenanigans happened. You know, is it a lab leak? Is it not a lab leak? Is it, you know, does the vaccine stay put where it goes, or does it actually go systemic? You know, all these different things. And suddenly, I don't know if fewer people are or I want to say it the other way, if more people are open to the notion that there might be some shenanigans going on behind the scenes, or if the people who are open to the notion that shenanigans are going on are way more vocal about it. You know, I don't know if people's eyes have been opened or if people are just crankier about it now. But when I mentioned that there is this kind of globalist elite push towards a food system that is owned lock, stock, and barrel from the production side, like Bill Gates is the largest owner of farmland in the United States now, to the intellectual property of you know, the type of food that we eat. So like Impossible Burger and, you know, Impossible Sausage and all this stuff. The process of turning raw materials into that is an IP owned entity. And from like a James Bond supervillain perspective, it's genius. Own all the land, own all the patenting and processing of converting food, real food, into this kind of fake food, and then own the branding around this hockey puck that looks, you know, that kind of looks like meat and smells like meat and even kind of bleeds like meat. Own all of that stuff. Like it really is brilliant from just kind of a you know, capitalist, you know, wet dream kind of deal. But the thing is that initially Impossible Foods touted itself as being healthier than regular meat, and they just got absolutely taken to task on that because it's a highly processed food. Even in animal feedings, the animals get sick eating too much of it because it's full of, like, you know, bad fats and, you know, processed pea proteins and all these things that maybe aren't terrible for you in modest amounts, but like it really shouldn't replace staple foods. And then there was this claim that they were more sustainable. And this was just an amazing moment where there was a life cycle analysis for Impossible Burger. And a life cycle analysis is trying to look at literally every input and every output for something. So like, you know, how much energy is consumed by the trucks that drive the fertilizer to the farm that raises the soybeans that get converted into the soybeans. And when those soybeans are harvested, they go to a facility that houses them. How much energy is consumed keeping the facility not too hot and not too cool, and how much energy goes into the pesticides to kill the mice that try to eat the soybean. Like, it's this massive project to do a life cycle analysis, but they looked at the full life cycle analysis and also the carbon footprint of this Impossible Burger. And then a couple of years after that, a life cycle analysis was performed by the same company, this company Qantas, that does these life cycle analyses, and they did it for the White Oaks Pasture Burger. And what was fascinating about that is the White Oaks Pasture Burger was actually net carbon negative. It took more carbon out of the atmosphere than what it released. And it was exactly the amount that was released by the production of an Impossible Burger. So to be carbon neutral, you could eat one Impossible Burger and one White Oak Pasture Burger, and you were carbon neutral. Or if you just ate the White Oak Pasture Burger, you were carbon negative and you were pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere than what you were releasing by the consumption of that thing. So that's where like these Impossible Foods, Impossible Burger, the lab grown meat, like all these things have been sold as like these sustainability options and these ethical options and everything. And it's an absolute lie. Most places that you go, when you buy gasoline, it will say contains up to 10% ethanol, when you're buying your gas for your car. It was many years ago, but there was a move to subsidize the production of corn to be turned into ethanol to supplement our gas so that we didn't burn as much oil in the form of petroleum. That's fine, other than the reality that it costs more energy to make a gallon of ethanol than it does to just have the gallon of gasoline. So it's a boondoggle. It's an absolute boondoggle. Like, it is sold as this environmentally friendly thing, but the people who raise the corn to make the ethanol don't use ethanol to drive their tractors. They use gasoline because it's cheaper than the ethanol is by and large, and it's more sustainable over the long haul, ironically. So this is very similar to the story within Impossible Foods and like these lab grown meats and whatnot. Like what we're talking about for this meat production piece, at least, is hundreds of millions of acres of land that is heated by the sun, watered by the rain and the snow and the mist, and that these animals have co-evolved with for hundreds of millions of years. And that is there. And we can either use it and use it wisely, or we can let it go fallow and let the land be destroyed, or we can turn it, pave it over and turn it into a parking lot, I guess. Like those are kind of the options that we have with it. But when it's interesting that Impossible Foods came out of the gate really hard and had these claims around health, and they got taken to task for that. Then they had these sustainability claims, and it clearly is no better. It's clearly worse than like just basic meat, just standard meat, to say nothing of pastured meat. And then it weaves in the ethical consideration there. Like, is it really cool that like 6 companies own the rights to producing 95% of the food that's consumed on the planet, which is what we're in right now? And I'm a big fan of markets and capitalism and stuff like that. But I think that this is an example of where we do really well. Like the thing I'm advocating for is that there should be a whole bunch of people that raise and grow food, not like 6 people. And this is the system that I'm advocating for, that this should be decentralized. The ownership should be decentralized. Going forward, like, there's all this concern around what will we as human beings do as AI takes over more and more jobs. Like doctoring and lawyering seems really complex, but really what it is are algorithms. You fall into these different buckets, and it becomes very algorithmically driven. Creative problem solving type endeavors are arguably the last thing that AI will ever, get into. And all that regenerative ag and regenerative food production is about is problem solving. Like that, it is a creative endeavor every day. It is not formulaic. You have to really, get out and have a lay of the land and a feel for what's going on and the time of the year, and factor in weather forecasts and all this stuff. It doesn't lend itself to algorithms at all. And so even on like a quality of life standpoint, you could make the argument going forward that instead of having tens of millions of people out of work and kind of destitute and not really having meaning in their life, they should be working on small working farms and be, cooperative owners in these endeavors, and have a multi-generational legacy play in these things. We're starting to talk about like meaningful human work.
Just thinking about that aspect, it's not talked about enough. Folks right now, we're not just dealing with multiple epidemics of chronic disease. We're dealing with multiple epidemics of mental health issues as well, and a loss of a sense of connectivity, community, sense of purpose. And there's study after study affirming how these things affect our lifespan and our health span, just even being connected to meaningful work, And so I think there's something to be said for reconnecting to something very primitive with humans, which is having a hand in where our food is coming from, being able to feed ourselves. And I think that that's going to be something that is going to become more present as we move into the future. And we're knocking on the door right now. We got 8 billion folks, 8 billion human beings on the planet, 6 companies feeding everybody. Something doesn't sound right. Again, coming from where we come from, where, each tribe, they're this collective thing, not to mention, even if we get a little bit closer to today, we have the local farming of our food and a diversity, right? Whereas today it's this very cookie cutter, it's so much marketing and politicization of what humans should be eating. And oftentimes, again, I'm a big fan of results. Look at how we're doing right now in America right now. We're knocking on the door of about 250 million of our citizens are overweight or obese. And I think this was prior to COVID, by the way. I know that COVID has just come in and kind of,
kicked it right in the jimmy. Yeah.
Exactly. Get it going right to that next level, So again, thank you so much for putting your time and energy into this project, because when we started this episode and you mentioned the fact, like, we have a Netflix society, really, we have a Netflix kind of driven, cultivated society where a film might just be the thing that can galvanize folks. And also it's so much more consumable in the way that we see things. But then you have the book where you do the deeper dives and you can really articulate things to another level. So can you let everybody know where they could pick up the book and where they could check out the film as well?
So you can go to sacredcow.info, and the book, the film, all the resources are there. And Diana continues to release all this amazing material. Like, if people ask you a question, if you're wondering about this stuff, like, do cows consume way more water than what is good? Like, we have resources that talk about that and peel back the details and look at the nuance. So that's definitely where folks want to go.
So many important nuggets to take away from this episode. Most importantly, getting more involved in where our food is actually coming from and thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about what we're passing on for future generations, and also thinking about who is moving the chess pieces around on the chessboard, determining what type of food we're actually getting and how all this stuff is taking place. To hear that Bill Gates owns the most farmland here in the United States, that doesn't sound suspicious at all. Keep in mind, Bill Gates is the same individual that's now funding a project to spray a cloud of chemicals around the earth itself to help to block out sunlight, to help to cool the planet down, to reduce global warming. The thrust of this mission, and this is a real thing, to put a protective layer around the earth, basically, that is generated by spraying out these chemicals around the globe. This is a real idea, as if he's Tony Stark's or something, to put a protective belt around the earth using technology, essentially. But this story sounds so far-fetched, but it is a real thing. As a matter of fact, listen to this report from CNBC.
It would look something like this. Thousands of planes would fly very high and use nozzles to inject millions of tons of light-reflecting particles into the stratosphere. It would create a thin chemical cloud of those particles around the whole planet, blocking some sunlight from reaching the surface. It would mimic a giant volcanic eruption, which we know cools the earth.
Now, when you have these harebrained ideas, you don't think about the wider ramifications. For example, if less sunlight is able to make its way to the surface of the earth, specifically being able to reach the human body, what then happens as far as a production of critical internal chemistry for human health? For example, UVB rays. Only if of all the UV light that's reaching from the sun to us, we've got UVA, UVB, and UVC. UVC is essentially just blocked out by the ozone layer, but it has the most energy, shortest wavelength. UVA has the longest wavelength, but the least amount of energy. That's what's predominantly reaching the surface of the earth. Of all the sun rays that reach us, 95% are UVA. All right. And this is how you get a tan. All right. But UVB, about 5% of all the sun rays that reach the earth is in the form of UVB. This is what is the catalyst for making vitamin D, which is a critical steroid hormone that the human body needs to not just survive, but to thrive. And as a matter of fact, if we are thinking about how our manipulation of the environment, is that affecting our vitamin D status? Well, a study published in the journal Nature Reviews Endocrinology determined that air pollution can be a causative agent in vitamin D deficiency. Already just what we're putting out into the environment with the way that we're living our lives, let alone, but these guys are not thinking about that. They're not thinking about how critical vitamin D is in reducing your risk for cancer and reducing your risk for infectious diseases. Because a study published in the BMJ, one of our most prestigious medical journals, found that COVID-19 ICU risk was 20 times greater in people who are deficient in vitamin D. This is well established. Now we've got about 24 plus studies that are identifying this specific issue as being a major risk factor. Another study found that simply lifting up our vitamin D levels can be an effective treatment for recovery from SARS-CoV-2. And this study, again, published in the BMJ, it's a separate study, was a randomized, placebo-controlled study that gave patients with SARS-CoV-2 short-term high-dose vitamin D for just 7 days and gave another group of SARS-CoV-2 patients a placebo. Here's what happened. A greater proportion of the vitamin D deficient individuals, by the way, everybody was vitamin D deficient coming into it. A greater proportion of vitamin D deficient individuals with a COVID-19 infection turned SARS-CoV-2 negative faster with a significant decrease in inflammatory biomarkers by getting high-dose vitamin D3 supplementation. The amount used in the study was about 60,000 IUs daily for just a short time period, but it helped people to clear the virus faster. And why is it? It's a catalyst for so many different immune parameters in the human body, driving and controlling different expressions of the immune system, whether it's identifying and eliminating rogue cells like cancer cells or infectious diseases, pathogens in the system. It makes the immune system, it's a driver, primary component of driving immune system function. What happens when you block out the sun with the chemical spray, when you're spraying out around the globe? What happens? Is that really the solution? Is that really a smart idea? What are the it's trying to target a short-term thing, a short-term issue, one issue, and creating 1,000 more issues, right? That's the mentality that's tending to reign supreme at this moment. But as Robb was mentioning at the end there, being a bit cynical, but also, again, he's a very optimistic person, but just kind of kicking these ideas around that, hey, maybe this is what needs to happen in order for us to wake up, in order for us to understand that there are so many different things that we've allowed to take place, that we've normalized, that are destroying our families, that are destroying the human race, period. We're not doing well. Superficially, we think that we're so evolved. But we are now the sickest, most chronically diseased society in history, the most sedentary culture in the history of humanity, the most obese society in the history of humanity. Something is clearly awry. Something is off here. And these times might just be the catalyst, the launching pad for us to help to turn this stuff around. And I know that we can. But this is why education is so important. And also for us to maintain a level of healthy skepticism in questioning who's controlling what you see, who's controlling what you do, what you have access to in the first place. Because here in the United States, the First Amendment, the very First Amendment, is that of freedom of speech. And we can say that, these different tech companies are doing what they want to do because it's their own entity and it's their own intellectual capital. But in reality, these entities are 1000% working along with our government, and also just government regulation has its hands all up in there. All right, all up on all these different social media platforms and these big tech platforms, and collecting our data. Like, so much has come out about, of course, just this illegal tracking of our citizens, and now censorship is rising to the forefront of people are, maybe again it had to get this way so that we say, you know what, I don't need you to regulate what I'm seeing and what I'm not seeing. I am an intelligent human being, and I have the ability to question things and to think critically. I don't need you to spoon feed me what you believe the truth is, which ultimately, I'd say a good solid 99% of the time, the truth is going to have a myriad of different expressions. It's not going to be one flavor, because even with these different peer-reviewed studies, especially observational data, we can shift the narrative around to fit our approach. And it's rare that you're going to have someone that is coming into it understanding their bias. I'm understanding my bias and then looking at the data and thinking, okay, how am I wrong? Let me look at this through the lens of somebody who would think the opposite of me. They're coming into it looking at the data like vitamin D doesn't matter at all. It's just something Ludacris talked about in the song. He's talking about giving the vitamin D. All right. It has nothing to do with our health and wellness, except, never mind. But this is what could be happening. And I can look at it through that lens that, it doesn't matter. And try and find leverage points in the data to affirm that, right? I could say, this is actually, it's done in vitro. It's not done actually in the real world or on people were actually, managing and using objective measurements, or maybe it's all subjective, right? These are just subjective tracking. We're not actually looking at people's blood work, whatever. I could try and find holes in anything. And so it's rare that somebody is coming into it looking at things from multiple perspectives. And this is one of the reasons why I'm doing this work today. And I really want to impress that upon everybody as often as possible, to start to come into things looking at things from multiple perspectives and being aware that we inherently think that our way is the way. We think that our way is the right way as a human being because we don't want to be wrong. Being wrong could mean a serious threat to our livelihood, to our life, and also our acceptance into the tribe, into culture. So being wrong bears a big psychological weight for us that we might not be aware of. But the crazy part is, the more that we are willing to be wrong, the more often we're actually going to be right. All right? The more willing that we are to be wrong, the more often we're going to tend to be right, because we're coming into it not just having this strong anchor and planting our flag that this way is the right way and it's the only way and it's the only truth. And so working on ourselves so we're coming into it like that. Of course, now, oftentimes, many of our biases, especially if you have achieved a level of real world success with your own example, if we're talking about in the domain of health, for example, if you've achieved a level of health and vitality within your own body, and you have that experiential knowledge, that bias even holds more weight. We've even got to understand which of our biases hold more credibility, right? And also looking towards other people and seeing their experiential outpicturing of what health is, like a Bill Gates. You put our pictures up side by side. Just say, he didn't have the billies. Just take that off the board. Just two guys. Just say you didn't know me. Two guys. Who are you going to take health advice from? Just based on something very superficial. How's he doing? How's he doing with his, of course, he doesn't care about getting sunlight. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about vitamin D. He doesn't care about what kind of meat he's eating or, fake meat or whatever the case is. These concepts are irrelevant to him, and he's going to tell you that outwardly with his persona. All right? He's going to throw on the sweater vest. Right now, he's rocking the 2X sweater vest. all good. But don't tell me how to be healthy. That's the problem. All right. And so he could be working on his health, and that would be amazing. And he can get some type of level of achievement and then seek to share his experience and his advice. But for right now, my man's devolving, you know. He's turning into one of these lizard people everybody's afraid of with the aliens out here. You know, now let me reel it back in, all right? I'm throwing the fishing line, let me reel it back in. Billy G is not my lover, all right? Maybe he's an amazing human being. You still gotta leave that door open, all right? See, my bias might be kicking in here. But, you know, for me, it's just looking at like, no, for real, this is definitely a concern and a red flag for me that this human being is buying up all this farmland in the United States. To what end? Not really even understanding what's happening with the soil and with the farmland here in the United States. And really, there's a worldwide issue that's taking place as humanity has been siphoning and abusing and taking advantage of our planet. That literally, this is the extent of it. Let me share this with you. When you look in the mirror and you see yourself, everything that you see came from the earth. All right? When you're looking at yourself in the mirror, every single thing that you see looking back at you came from this planet. Every cell of your body came from the earth. The earth is alive. And you are an offspring of that. You are an example of the vitality of the planet. What happens when we break down and abuse and degrade our planet? We will inherently be degrading ourselves and our capacity to be great, to reach our potential, which this is the beauty of this whole thing, is that being that we are human beings living at this time, our potential is limitless. But we have to be able to recognize that. And the point is, it's a lot more difficult to recognize that when we're not healthy. It's a lot more difficult to recognize that when we're outsourcing our potential and our belief to the media, who has a vested interest in giving us this spoon-fed narrative about how things are. And that narrative is going to depend on which channel you're watching. How is that? That's not science. That's not science. And you'll very rarely see a narrative disrupting idea on any of these channels. If it doesn't fit that narrative that they've been spoon feeding you, you can lose viewership, lose stock prices. And ultimately, it's all about the money that's being made behind the scenes by grabbing our attention, unethically grabbing our attention, utilizing fear, because the vast majority of network news is just a constant cycle of fear, And most folks don't realize this, but Harvard did a wonderful report where they were trying to express more transparency in where our major network news funding is coming from, right? So again, published by Harvard, which, you know, for many folks, they're the, top tier of prestige. And what they disclosed was repeatedly, station after station, whether it's CNN or Fox or MSNBC or ABC, the primary funders for all of them included Vanguard and BlackRock, two massive financial management institutions driven to make money for their investors. All right. Is this about efficacy and education, or is it about making money? And you already know the answer to this. But the question is, are you still outsourcing your attention to these folks? And I'm so grateful for this time, because this is offering up an opportunity for us to wake up to those things, to sometimes be shaken awake and say, you know what, I choose other than. This is not okay. This is not working for our society. Just take a look around and we can do better. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
As we've commercialized and as we've capitalized, there has been places along the way where we've chemicalized these things. And so as we use them, there are things we're using every day that are actually undercutting us and our health.